Heroin use skyrocketed in the late 1960s and became a national epidemic by the mid-1970s. A large part of the increase was due to returning soldiers who had become addicted to the drug during the Vietnam War. Our society responded with an expansion of community-based treatment centers and increased law enforcement to combat the surge in crime. In 1972, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, which was in large part costly, inhumane, and ultimately failed, as its true intent was not to stop drug abuse at all, being later revealed as a guise for Nixon's real attack victims, the black community and anti-war left. Many street criminals took full advantage of the market for the highly addictive opioid, building low-level peddling into major drug operations, one of the largest being based in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project. But before the infamous Pruitt-Igoe gang would take rise in the criminal underworld, others had already cemented their names in the streets of St. Louis. An early notable figure to emerge was Joe Cooley. Cooley was a career criminal with several arrests during the 60s, including narcotics, robbery, and homicide, but only served 5 years of a 7-year sentence for assault with intent to kill. He was one of the first major players in the narcotics underworld, building a flourishing operation shown in luxury cars, multiple homes, and a grocery store. An associate noted that he was the first black guy in all of St. Louis to own a luxury Mark III Lincoln Continental. Cooley was described as very clever, with grand ideas for an even larger conglomerate, and began making connections with people outside of the black community, which many believed would ultimately cost him his life. On September 28, 1970, the body of Joe Cooley, age 31, was found in the basement of a home at 3311 North Euclid Avenue. 3 other bodies were found, including Cooley's girlfriend, Maudie Ross, and her 10-year-old son, and an associate named Robert E. Dunn, all with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Police linked this killing to a similar homicide the previous summer, where major drug pusher Clemon Wilkes and a female associate were found dead with gunshot wounds to the head in an apartment on West Florissant. Police said $1 million worth of heroin was found in the home. Of equal significance was a man known as T.J. Ruffin. By the time that the 70s heroin epidemic was in full effect, Ruffin was in his early 40s, having survived many street battles and had a lengthy arrest sheet and multiple convictions over decades, going back as far as 1947. When the influx of heroin hit, Ruffin became a top dealer with connections to Chicago and Indiana. His status made him a target, as reported in January of 1972, as T.J. Ruffin entered Lily's Tavern on North Sierra. Known drug kingpins Fred Parker and brothers Sam and Earl Davis, 27 and 33, followed behind, pointing a gun at TJ in an obvious setup. A tussle ensued, and Ruffin wrestled a gun from Sam and shot both of the Davis brothers, fatally wounding them. Ruffin was then shot in the back by Fred Parker. St. Louis police considered Ruffin a walking dead man from all his past crimes. While still recovering at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, Ruffin would say, "I'm not scared as long as my fears don't make me a coward. Life goes on. If I die, I'll die like a man." Ruffin would finally meet that fate at his longtime girlfriend's University Commons apartment in the summer of 1979. University City Police said they arrived at the apartment in response to reported shots fired and ordered Ruffin to come out. Shots continued to be fired from the apartment, prompting police to fire tear gas in return, which started a fire. Ruffin and his girlfriend's charred bodies would be pulled from the burned home. An autopsy revealed 10 white pills were found in Ruffin's stomach. 3 white pills were found in his girlfriend, along with a gunshot wound to her head, which killed her before the fire. It appears they may have taken their own lives before being burned. Career criminal Nate Sledge also had a lengthy record, with at least 20 arrests dating back to the 1950s. After being released in 1978, having served 7 of 12 years on narcotics charges, he was booked a few short months later as the murder suspect of a Creve Coeur businessman who owned the Esquire clothing shops in North St. Louis City. Police suspected Sledge of a few drug-related slayings years earlier, but could not link him to the murders. On a January night in 1980, Sledge and 2 others were seated in a parked car on North Spring Avenue. At about 9:25 p.m., 4 men approached the car, motioning to roll the windows down. When the passengers obliged, the men fired several shots in the car, killing Sledge. Unsatisfactory economic opportunities, harsh segregationalist laws, and white terrorism led more than 6 million black people to head north and west between 1910 and the 1970s. The movement would later be called the Great Migration. They took advantage of the need for industrial workers and hoped for better opportunities in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. Migration to St. Louis may have been more complex than these other cities due to Missouri history of being a border state that permitted slavery. Black migrants were forced into substandard housing in slums of downtown St. Louis, with rat-infested, outdated buildings, many of which still had outhouses and no central heat or running water. In an effort to replace rundown neighborhoods, housing projects were constructed. The largest of these projects was the Pruitt-Igoe, with 33 buildings, each 11 stories tall, opening in 1954. Within a decade, it would be a decrepit structure of falling brick, housing mostly poor black residents. Reports proliferated of property crime, gang activity, drug dealing, prostitution, and murder. Heaters, toilets, garbage incinerators, and electricity all malfunctioned. And at one point, the faulty plumbing let loose floods of raw sewage through the hallways. Ignoring glaring issues, the government focused on misguided stipulations and restrictions, which included banning males from the homes or faced the risk of eviction. Also, cost-cutting, even before construction began, led to buildings made of cheap material, which showed signs of strain shortly after the first occupants arrived. White flight left these concerns of poor black residents voiceless of their needs, and without the privilege to leave to other areas in heavily segregated St. Louis. From the soil and bricks of the project walls would emerge the Pruitt-Igoe gang, under leader Fats Woods. Arrested back in 1961 for stealing an interstate shipment as a juvenile, a felony conviction sent him to a federal reformatory. He would then be arrested 61 times over the next 10 years. At just 22 years old, Fats was already juggling two of his most serious cases of armed robbery and first-degree murder. At 26, the IRS began investigating Woods as they believed he had amassed and stashed away over $1 million. Soon to follow, there was a charge of shooting a man named Walker Lee Sanders in the arm, which later had to be amputated. However, with all these charges looming, residents defended Woods as an asset to the community, often giving back to an area in need when others wouldn't. He was known to pay residents rent when they couldn't afford to. But federal agents and officers were salivating to convict Woods. The St. Louis Chief of Police worked alongside the DEA and made plans to utilize 250 district officers in building a case. A federal drug indictment came down in February 1973. Woods, only 27 years old, was convicted in April 1973 to 30 years on 3 counts of selling heroin. The judge would say, "You are a danger to this community." Sylvester Atkins was the right-hand man of the Woods gang, said to be the businessman of the operation, and an elder mentor to many. Sylvester would be picked up with Woods by federal agents, and he was charged with selling heroin to an informant on 2 occasions. He would receive a 24-year sentence, 12 years for each sale, while only being 26 years of age. The Atkins family was from Pruitt-Igoe. Brother Claudel Atkins was a former Golden Gloves champion who trained alongside Leon and Michael Spinks, who were also from the same projects. However, his youngest brother, George Little Red Atkins, would follow a much more dangerous path. At just 16 years old, he was shot in the stomach in a shooting in front of a Pruitt-Igoe building. A year later, while leaving the Ambassador Theater at 7th and Locust with 2 associates, George Knoll and Zach Hopkins, Little Red was shot and killed, and his 2 associates wounded. Homicide detectives believe this killing was in retaliation for the slaying of 21-year-old Michael Blade, shot in the neck a year earlier. Michael Blade was the brother of Ronnie Blade, another major drug operator who was a rival of the Pruitt-Igoe gang. The chain of retaliatory shootings and violent deaths wouldn't stop there, as the following year, Ambrose Watson, 19, and Darnell Pearson, 21, were killed in an apartment building in the Central West End. Both were members of the Blade Gang and believed to be held responsible for the theater killing of Lil Red. Ronnie Blade would go on the run, escaping retaliation and fleeing his own criminal charges. The FBI would pick him up in Inglewood, California, where he was living in an apartment under a fake name. A third person was picked up by federal agents along with Fats Woods and Sylvester Atkins. That was Earl Williams Jr., or as news publications dubbed him due to his deadly reputation, Earl the Killer Williams. Earl was a top lieutenant of the Woods Gang and held respect from all, including rivals. A fair share of that respect came out of fear for the man known to have earned his nickname. Stunning the feds in the jury trial, Earl was acquitted of all charges that he also sold heroin to an informant. Earl would take this court victory as a sign to change his life. With Fats and Sylvester now convicted and serving prison bids, and enough money saved for a normal life, he went clean and enrolled in St. Louis Community College. He married Deborah Randall, whose family owned Randall Funeral Home on Natural Bridge Road. In his new life, he worked part-time in a community outreach program at the Yeatman Center on Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard. On a March afternoon in 1976, while leaving the Yeatman Center, he was gunned down in a professional-style hit. The shots fired from a vacant building directly across the street. A witness would identify two suspects, Alvin Lil Daddy Pullman and Dennis Heyman. The suspects from the Carr Square Village and Vaughn Housing Project were reputed rivals of the Pruitt-Igoe gang. However, homicide detectives were not able to gather evidence to charge the two. A still young Dennis Heyman, who was accused of driving the getaway car in the Earl shooting, he would build his own reputation as a feared man in the St. Louis drug underworld. He worked with Fats Woods early on, but the relationship turned sour and led to many shootouts between the two factions. Dennis also had a well-documented feud with the Petty brothers. While club and grocery owners by day, these two camps went all out in attempts to kill one another for top position in the heroin trade.
Sheriff, if you think I have any qualms about killing this kid, you couldn't be more wrong.
A remaining original member of the Pruitt-Igoe gang was an enforcer by the name of Duke Brock. Like Earl the Killer Williams, Duke was a man feared and highly respected, and one of the few whose reputation was built outside of the Pruitt-Igoe, residing on Bacon Street in the Jeff Vanderloo area. A tragic incident involving Duke occurred in the summer of 1973. Duke was estranged from his wife, Dorothy Brock, and in an argument with her new partner, Willie Dean Ruffin, the two exchanged gunfire, leaving Duke wounded. Willie Dean pleaded self-defense, and both men refused to press charges. About a week later, while Duke was said to be still recovering from his wounds in Homer G. Phillips, his estranged wife, Dorothy Brock, Willie Dean, and two others parked outside of the city methadone clinic. Moments later, over 15 shots fired into the parked car from a vacant building across the street, hitting the passengers. Dorothy Brock would die from the wounds. Willie Dean survived the shooting but feared for his safety as he laid in Homer G. Phillips, recovering from critical injuries. He heard rumors that Duke issued a contract on his life. Scared for his life, members of Willie Dean's family hired a private ambulance from Chicago and an Illinois State Police escort to immediately pick up Willie and transfer him out of St. Louis safely. Duke would continue in the life of crime and would reach his ultimate fate. On an August day, 5 years from the same exact day his estranged wife died, Duke Brock was killed with a gunshot to the head. The Evening World newspaper would report, "They finally got him." Standing over the body of Duke Brock in the basement of Ronald Jones' funeral home were the last and youngest remaining members of the Pruitt-Igoe gang. They were Rodney Calvin Woods, Noble Bennett, and the most notorious, Jerry Lewis. Jerry would be introduced to the gang by his older brother Jimmy Lewis, who was first very close with Fats Woods, all growing up in the Pruitt-Igoe together. Years earlier, Jimmy Lewis was killed on the courthouse steps by a rival from the Vaughn Projects by the nickname of Lil Rob. Robert Lil Rob Young had reported an incident prior stating that Earl the Killer Williams and Jimmy Lewis had attempted to rob him at a carnival. And when Lil Rob spotted Jimmy at the courthouse, a struggle ensued, ending with Lil Rob killing an unarmed Jimmy Lewis. Lil Rob would serve 14 years for that murder, and 2 days after being released to a halfway house on Papin Street, he was shot to death 3 times in the head as he slept on the 5th floor of the dormitory. Jerry Lewis would take the lead in building the drug trafficking empire, amassing $500,000 in his first year. All top lieutenants from Fats Woods on down would become multimillionaires at some point in the organization. They glossed in the spoils with more money than they could spend, women in excess, unique fabrics and custom suits, attended the highest profile boxing matches, and the latest luxury vehicles of the time. However, it would not be all celebratory, as he would be in and out of jail for multiple gun charges, including shootouts with Dennis Heyman. It was a prison stint in 1977 where he would join the religious organization the Moorish Science Temple of America. As with tradition with this Muslim group, he added Bey to his surname. Jerry Lewis-Bey contends that at this point in his life, he turned to a life of legitimacy, opening a grocery and liquor store, and entering into politics with the St. Louis chapter of the Moorish Temple. However, law enforcement increased pressure on Lewis-Bey. By the early 80s, the ATF, DEA, FBI, IRS, St. Louis City, and County all teamed up to develop investigation strategies. They decided he had not gone legitimate and spent over $1 million in an investigation connecting a series of murders and drug-related actions to shake Jerry Lewis-Bey. They went to great lengths to keep witnesses protected as they held him responsible for the death of a few possible informants. The state finally brought charges against Lewis-Bey, opening a trial that lasted 7.5 months, the longest in St. Louis history. On June 15, 1993, he was found guilty of racketeering and conspiracy to murder, receiving a life sentence, bringing an inevitable sad end to the Pruitt-Igoe gang. Lewis-Bey maintains his innocence. Although all that remains of the Pruitt-Igoe is ash and rumble of what once was, the legacy of those who emerged will reign in lore and infamy.